Did you know that there are 3 distinct layers to your unconscious mind? Beneath your feet, we have the darkened realms. This is the shadow territory that you dare not enter. And above the clouds, we have a shimmering landscape of illumination, baked and burnt by a blinding sun, equally inspirational and disorienting. And here you are, this little blue dot right in the middle, centered on your inner work journey towards integration and psychosynthesis, surrounded by an ocean called the middle unconscious. In this video, I'm going to be using this wonderful little egg to symbolize and signify a wide variety, depth, and breadth of psychological theory as it relates to the higher, middle, and lower unconscious, with my ultimate intention being something like a supportive guide in helping you expand that middle unconscious and making sure that this little blue dot is an authentic personality rather than a survival personality or a false self. Let me put this egg down and bring up today's question, which inspired this entire video. Metanoia asked me, "Great content, thank you. I'm currently reading The Primal Wound and only halfway through. It's a really insightful book. It mentions integrating the higher and lower unconscious, but up to now there's been no explanation on how to practically integrate. So my particular question is, how does one integrate the unconscious? Isn't that the question of the hour? Well, fortunately, thank you for the question, fortunately we have The Primal Wound to turn to, and this is without a doubt one of the top 3 books I've read this year in probably about 150 books and counted. It is such an incredible work of transpersonal psychotherapy, which looks at the work of Roberto Assayagoli, the founder of Psychosynthesis, and takes it further. Honestly, this book does the work of at least 10 books in one. I also have 10 books in front of me, which I'm going to hold up when the time is right, but we'll come to that when we come to that. How do we integrate the higher and lower unconscious? Well, I'm going to show you a diagram that is a much more accurate representation, hopefully you can see it, of the little egg which I've held up. Here you can see the bands between the higher unconscious and the lower unconscious, as well as the positive and negative unifying centers and personality structures. We'll get to those in a moment. First, let's expand what it means to be in the higher or lower unconscious. In a nutshell, it's positive and negative territory. There's actually a list of traits which I'm going to read out to you. I'll just call upon some of them. It's really obvious and intuitive. The lower unconscious, these are the feelings of anxiety and disintegration, emptiness or hollowness, feeling overwhelmed, helpless or hopeless, isolated, abandoned and banished, endless despair. It's the dark night of the soul. These are the repressed shadow tendencies that we tend to think of when we're doing shadow work, and they exist beneath our consciousness. But also we have a repressed territory above our consciousness, and we'll have to turn to Maslow and his theory of self-actualization to get some insight into what that might feel like. And he has his classic 14 being values, which are also referenced in The Primal Wound, and we have truth, goodness, beauty, wholeness, dichotomy, transcendence, aliveness, uniqueness, perfection, necessity, completion, justice, order, simplicity, richness, effortlessness, playfulness, and self-sufficiency. I highly recommend you read this if you're interested in that higher level of development. This is the higher and lower unconscious in a nutshell, but both exist beyond our comprehension because we are fundamentally seated in the middle unconscious territory. This is an important distinction which is very rarely made when we're looking at integrating the higher and lower unconscious, and I think this elastic band is going to come off any moment now, so we'll have to go just with words if this egg fails me. The middle unconscious is the space where we exist as a fundamental personality. See, there goes the elastic band. I think we've probably just integrated all of our higher unconscious potential, so now we are literally demigods on Earth. Maybe that's what's going to work, but I don't think it works that way. Nonetheless, imagine that the band's still there. Middle unconscious, This is the territory where we become aware of symptoms, but not quite willing to go beyond that awareness into an actual integration state. I'll explain how to do this. Ultimately, we need to turn to the primal wound to get a direct quote, and the reason that I'm probably floundering a little bit this moment is I've just spent the last 3 days reviewing this book, and there's at least 60 quotes I wanted to bring forwards, and I think I've limited myself to just 2. Again, I've got another 9 books to hold up, but we'll get there. We will integrate our higher and lower unconscious. Wonderful summary from John Furman. Quote, "These two sectors are largely repressed, leaving the conscious personality in a more stable configuration, relatively oblivious of the heights above and the depths below. In this way, the positive is conserved, the negative is hidden, and a secure normality is attained. Although there may be variations of this, the positive-negative split seems to be a basic pattern of the human personality." And crucially, what we're talking about is relationships. We're talking about the shift from survival personality to authentic personality, and in that authentic personality, we're talking about developing a relationship to the higher and the lower. This is what integration truly means. We're a fulcrum, we're a balancing point between the higher and lower realms, and if we truly want to integrate the unconscious, we need to be expecting and aware of expanding our middle unconscious territory. Of course, as you expand into the higher, the lower also expands. It's something I've spoke about on this channel before. You shine the light even brighter into the darkness, and the shadow territory seems paradoxically even darker. So how do we integrate the middle unconscious? Well, primarily we need to look at the relationship to the lower and the upper. Let's begin with the lower. I'll actually take this as an opportunity to hold up this little stack of books that I've got. Here is a representative selection of some of the therapeutic modalities which work at the lower bands of repressed, damaged, and oftentimes traumatic material. Got these 5 books. We've got Alexander Lowen's book, The Fear of Life. This is talking about the underlying fear of life. It's a bioenergetic approach towards the blockages and energetic anxieties that we experience inside of ourselves. Highly recommended. We've got Alice Miller's work on the betrayal of the child, which is revolutionary if you ever looked into child psychology and how trauma lives inside of you. Again, recommend this. We've got Primal Scream Therapy by Dr. Arthur Janov. Now, this is a fantastic book if you're looking to unblock your throat and reclaim the power of your yes and your no, and releasing all of the pent-up anger and resentment that you still have towards those people who did you wrong without necessarily getting punitive. Safe environment, safe therapeutic work. That's how we work with the lower unconscious. A few more books. We have actually a wild card in here. We have Stanislav Grof, who is a transpersonal psychologist of great significance, and he talks about the condensed experiences, the coex systems, which is a terminology and a theory which I don't need to go into too much, but effectively he talks about things like birth trauma. And birth trauma is definitely a lower unconscious kind of experience because it starts at the very beginning. It's very primal, it's very archaic, and you can work with things like birth trauma and in utero experiences, and especially those early years, pre-memory years, to get more of an understanding of your lower unconscious territory. And finally, Trauma and the Soul by Donald Cowshed. This is a Jungian take on how our soul navigates and protects us from those early traumatic experiences with a view towards integration and liberation from that which is bleeding. Another wonderful book that I recommend you read. Lower unconscious is the repressed territory, but it's not just negative experiences. This is a big mistake that we actually fall into when we're talking about shadow material more generally. Again, the shadow is a territory, not an entity. It's not just one thing, it's a shadow territory below and a golden shadow territory above, which is why I said that the upper unconscious is often very disorienting. It's spiritual bypassing, spiritual grandiosity, mystic flight, schizophrenic paranoid energies sometimes when not grounded, but we'll come to that later. When it comes to lower unconscious, we do have primarily a feeling of repression and anxiety and deathly suicidal energies. But there is the possibility of having a positive lower unconscious. But we'll return to this once I've expanded on the higher unconscious and hopefully weave it all together. Might as well hold up the books that I've got for the higher unconscious. Here we go. A nice 5 stack. You've already seen Abraham Maslow and his theories of self-actualization. No surprise there. We have William James, the classic American psychologist at the turn of the 20th century, and his varieties of religious experience. This is where we're going towards mysticism. Quite literally, we are going towards mysticism with Evelyn Underhill. I did a video on this very book, and it's a much deeper dive into this, again, classic, Christian mysticism and what it means to get into those higher realms. Have to read it for yourself. And 2 more books. Cosmic Consciousness by Richard Buke, another classic in the space. It is what it says on the cover. And actually a more challenging book. Those are kind of interesting books, but not too groundbreaking. If you want a real piece of transpersonal psychology, and I'm talking some high-level theory and practice, go towards Michael Washburn, Embodied Spirituality in a Sacred World. I thought it was in a grounded world, but that's my bias. This is an incredible work in regards to how to integrate those higher unconscious energies in a way where you won't lose your footing. You'll genuinely and generally remain in that middle unconscious territory, that grounded, egoic, authentic self, without getting lost into the fairy realms. This is a highly sophisticated book. I'm not really doing it justice, but you'll have to read it for yourself. How do we work with the realms? How do we practically integrate? Now that we've, identified this is the higher, this is the lower, and we're existing something like a ego or a false self, or potentially, hopefully, enough of an authentic self in the middle, which relates to these 2 realms, we need to understand the concept of the unifying center. This is something which really bears a lot of importance in one-to-one therapeutic space, because the unifying center is like a magnet which draws in energies, the archetypes, all of the various fragments of the upper and lower realms as the relationship that we're talking about. I want you to literally imagine a magnet which can draw down the higher like a beam of white light reaching towards those kind of goddess archetypes, those mystical experiences, those peak glimpses into higher human potential, and also reaches down with a red thread connecting into the archaic unconscious. Something which is really quite a scary territory to go into, but not something which need be inaccessible when done in the right proportion. A truly helpful, unifying center is something which we were ideally given by our parents when we were younger. When you're developing, let's say up to the age of about 2, the mirroring, validating, empathic response of the mother will be an external unifying center which mirrors our sense of self in a way where we create safety and security in beingness in the world. It's a complex way of saying a good mom gives you attention, and through giving that attention in a loving, compassionate way, you then confirm your sense of existing. And without that center being in play, you get schizophrenic children who never bond with anyone. It's a really tragic thing, but it's not something which need be the fate forever. What happens in one-to-one space with a therapist or a counselor or a friend or a romantic partner who's particularly good at listening is they provide an external unifying center to mirror and validate higher and lower possibilities so that we can expand our sense of self. Of course, the next step is to develop an internal unifying center. External and internal would benefit from both, but the internal unifying center is something like morals, values, beliefs, and expectations for the future. This is generally associated with the higher territories, but I need to remind you that although you might have an internal unifying center which operates at the higher bands, of course we've already integrated our higher unconscious in this video because the band has been completely removed, but I need to remind you that it's a permeable membrane. It's not something which is fixed, it's something which will expand as your awareness expands. But to be able to go into this lower unconscious, you need to have a lower unifying center. And normally this will be quite tricky territory because often we'll have something like an archetype or a part which is a loser, maybe a violent part, maybe an inner critic part, maybe some kind of demonic part even. This will operate in the lower unconscious, and then in the higher unconscious, we'll have a positive, higher, internal unifying center ideally, which will be something like the god or the goddess, the king or the queen, the lover, the healthy, truly mature lover, or any other form of higher ideal, basically the ideal version of you, that will operate in the upper unconscious. You can see how complex the territory gets. It's really a very dense area that I'm trying to speak into. Let's sum it all back up and let's bring it into something which can be useful in terms of you actually integrating these energies. What can you do to form these relationships? Fundamentally, we're expanding the middle unconscious, but to be able to look clearly towards the clouds and then beyond the clouds and to go deeper into the shadow territory, we need to have some form of magnetization, an internal unifying center in both territories. We need to be familiar with things like the general archetypal representatives of each territory, the positive light beings and the dark bad beings. I'm oversimplifying, but you get what I'm saying. And then as we expand from that middle unconscious territory with an awareness of the unifying centers of both bands of potential unconscious experience, we start to draw in their energies and create something like an authentic self. There are dozens of books written about what it means to be in the self energy rather than an ego identity or a survival personality, but for the sake of this video, we'll just call it your authentic self. And the authentic self need not integrate everything in the upper and everything in the lower. There are gifts in the lower which we often don't speak about. For example, for men, although in civil society we might repress what it means to be able to fight and to be able to fuck and to be able to dominate in a way where it's obviously oppressive and we shouldn't do that in the context of taking power over someone, to be able to be tapped into those energies consciously and use them where appropriate in a truly appropriate context like training in the gym or a moment with a consenting romantic partner. That's tapping into lower unconscious territory, an older, more primal aspect of masculinity, which of course shouldn't form the whole of your personality, but there should be a relationship. You should know how to do both of those things. And in the same way as a man, I'll stay with men as an example, if you aim towards the higher unconscious, you should know how to be more priestly and more fatherly and more genuinely artistic and aiming towards something like a nature mysticism or a deity mysticism or some form of esoteric tradition which is integrated into your religious element of your personality. Of course, it goes into creativity as well. I'm oversimplifying, of course. A massive territory for women. It's very similar. There are differences and distinctions between the genders, but ultimately, to create an authentic self, we don't need to integrate everything in both layers of the unconscious because it's an impossible task. You will never integrate all of the dark shadow and the light shadow. It's a fool's errand. But you can form relationships, and that red thread going downwards, that white thread going upwards, the egg, one more time, I just want this to land in your awareness. If all you take from this video is that you're an egg with different forms of awareness operating in a relationship to this unifying center right here, then I've done my job. Read these books for yourself. Understand that there is more to be experienced, but there's not a rush to go about integrating everything which is yet to be integrated. Some things can't be integrated, and some things never would want to be integrated. If we take that dominating energy that I just spoke about in the lower unconscious, and if we take that higher energy of being something like a priestly shamanic figure, I personally would never want to fully integrate what it means to be a shaman or a shamanistic traditional, like shamanistic otherworldly character, or that very aggressive, very brutal, masochistic form of masculinity, because I lose my center. I can't over-identify with one particular archetype, and it would be very unwise to put in too much emphasis towards the higher or lower territory at the detriment of expanding the middle territory and knowing that we move from falsehood to truth as we progressively integrate that which was unknown. We withdraw our projections from the world. We find positive, external, unifying centers in loved ones, good therapists, and good friends, and progressively we create an internal unifying center which operates like a magnet in both realms to bring us the best that we could possibly bring together. I think we've just approached the 20-minute mark. A hell of a lot of information here. I've held up 10 different books, plus the Primal Wound. I will hold it up one more time. This is a book you need to read. It's one of the best books I've read all year. It does the work of at least 10, if not 20 books. Hidden gem, truly hidden gem. It will explain everything that I've just spoken about in far more detail and far more clarity, because I've had 20 minutes and this author had at least 50 years. So I hope this helped, and I hope that you feel confident in integrating your higher and lower unconscious. And if you want an immediate practical next step, click over on this video. We're talking about the anima and the animus, the Jungian archetypes, the masculine and the feminine. It's going to be a very much related video to what we've just spoken about. So I'll see you over there.